right, we're going to get started. This lecture is the one lecture I'm giving this weekend that I've been most excited about. Congratulations to all of you for showing up to something called Kernoozers and Antiquarian Antagonistics, having probably no idea what the hell that's about. I find it fascinating material, and it's material I've been working with for 25 years now, and will eventually write this up and publish it in some form, because there's a huge market for books on Kernoozers and Antiquarian Antagonistics. First, by a show of hands, how many of you are involved with or have ever done any sword fighting? Yeah. In some way, shape, or form? Yeah? Okay. I'm glad you're here, because you probably would not have raised your hands had it not been for the guys that I'm about to talk about, which I'm about to speak. Our focus really is on two men in particular, one by the name of Egerton or Edgerton Castle, and the other, this chap, Captain ALFRED HUTTON. And they really kind of laid the foundation of all historical European martial arts or Western martial arts, and the revival that has taken place throughout Europe. And while the Victorian revival is often appreciated in our sword circles, it's largely dismissed out of hand because of two particular negative stereotypes. One is several oft-quoted passages from Egerton Castle's book, Schools and Masters of Fence, where he has a very Victorian view of history. And two, due to a modern perception that the 19th century marked a sort of evolution or devolution of European swordsmanship into what was merely sport. Which is, both perspectives do have merit, but they're both incomplete. So careful examination will show that these guys are actually great pioneers and innovators. It can be argued that Hutton and Castle essentially invented and certainly popularized the systematic practice of revived historical fencing, and in that they achieved a level of historical accuracy unmatched until pretty much the last 15 to 20 years. Take, for example, the following passage from, first of all, that's Captain ALFRED HUTTON. There is Egerton Castle. And this is fencing scholar Carl Albert Thym, or Tim, we're not sure. He wrote, curiously enough, it is in England, the country which for so long has neglected the systematic practice of this fascinating sport, that the true character of ancient swordplay and its evolution toward the highly perfect art which we now call fencing was first elucidated. Investigation of the doctrine of ancient masters of fence and bibliographic compilation of fencing works were things normally naturally bound to go hand in hand. Both are virtually branches of what now has become the fashion to speak of as kernoozing. And this investigation, at least in a really systematic manner, belongs to quite modern times. That comes from a complete bibliography of fencing and dueling published 1896. So, what do we know of these men and how did this revolution begin? Back to him. Egerton Castle. In the year 1878, the acclaimed British actor-director Henry Irving, Sir Henry Irving actually, revived his famous production of Hamlet with himself in the title role. Amongst the most lauded scenes in what was widely held to be a masterful revival was the fencing match between Hamlet and Laertes in the final act. Seated in the Lyceum Theatre audience one evening, enraptured most particularly by the cut and thrust of the rapier, was a young university student named Egerton Castle. Castle was so inspired that over the next 3 decades, he would become instrumental in leading and serve a leading role in the revival of Elizabethan fencing in Victorian Britain. Castle was born in London on the 12th of March in the year 1858. His father was heir to a substantial fortune via the burgeoning newspaper industry, and he traveled widely throughout the European continent, introducing young Egerton to artists, musicians, and men of letters, including Donizetti and Verdi, Liszt, Rossini, Gounod, Alexander Dumas, Robert Browning, and many other notables. Egerton was physically delicate, and his father instituted a rather Spartan regime of exercises to develop his constitution and physique. These included long hiking tours, as well as wrestling, rowing, gymnastics, riding, boxing, and the fundamentals of the sport of fencing. When he graduated from the Lycée Condorcet in Paris, at the age of 15, Egerton was fluent in Spanish, German, French, Italian, as well as English, with a thorough working knowledge of Latin and Greek. As you do. 2 years of private tutoring followed, then matriculation at the University of Glasgow, where his studies included chemical philosophy, whatever chemical philosophy is, I love that, and practical physics. Finally returning to London at the age of 18, Egerton Castle enrolled first at King's College before winning a science scholarship to Trinity College, Cambridge. He later referred to his 4 years at Cambridge as, quote, a fragrant chapter in my life. At the time, he planned to pursue an academic professorship. Didn't we all? However, owing to his father's eclectic intellectual, cultural, and physical training regimen, Castle was of an active as well as scholarly temperament. In 1878, inspired by Henry Irving's swordplay as Hamlet, he began to formally study fencing, building upon a boyhood lessons that his father had arranged for him. Egerton competed in a fencing tournament at Cambridge and won a prize donated by Angelo's Fencing School in London, which at the time still existed, though Angelo was long dead. In 1880, seeking ever more robust adventures, Castle joined Sandhurst Military Academy, where he gained a commission as a cavalry officer. He was promoted twice within 2 years, and in 1882 won a gold medal in swordsmanship as a competitor in the prestigious Royal Tournament and Assault at Arms, which was a national competition in all manner of soldierly skills. It was also in that year that he was particularly impressed by an essay written by the esteemed barrister, Sir Frederick Pollock, entitled, quote, The Forms and History of the Sword. Failing to secure a placement in his preferred regiment, Castle eventually gave up his commission and found himself in search of a profession, and indeed, a life outside either formal military or academic disciplines. Initially, he chose law, enrolling for a short time at the Inner Temple, but he quickly found that he had little patience for that subject. He then flirted with the idea of becoming a professional pursuivant of arms and enrolled for a time in the Herald's College, as is in the Victorian Herald's College, of course. However, he found that while his prior education was a superb preparation for a career in heraldry, he was increasingly drawn to writing on other more personally engaging topics. So in 1883, Castle wooed and then married a beautiful and brilliant young Irish lady named Agnes Sweetman, and the two of them settled into a professional and personal collaboration which was to last the rest of their lives. Castle had already written a number of well-received articles on various topics, but upon marrying Agnes, who also had literary ambitions, he committed himself to a working life as a professional author. Intrigued by the article he had read, Castle had an opportunity to attend a lecture on swords and swordplay by Sir Frederick Pollock, during which the latter commented to the effect that an account of the development of fencing would require not a discourse, but rather an entire book, and that such a book had not to that point ever been written. Perhaps coincidentally, in 1882, a French fencer and bibliophile, Monsieur Vigand, did produce such a work entitled La Bibliographie de l'escrime ancienne et moderne. As a survey of swordplay texts, it was met with great enthusiasm within the fencing community, although it was criticized for missing some important works, especially those written in any language other than French. Castle's mounting enthusiasm for the subject of fencing was further spurred by the announcement that the famed explorer, ethnologist, and linguistic scholar, Sir Richard Francis Burton, or should I say Captain Sir Richard Francis Burton, who Queen Victoria always referred to as that great beast. That's a resume I want. He was one of Castle's personal heroes, and Burton at the time was planning a magnum opus on the study of the sword itself, rather than the systems of its use. You may be familiar with Burton's The Book of the Sword, which is the very first typography of sword design around the world. Actually, we have The Book of the Sword, Volume 1. Volume 2 was burnt by his wife after his death. So, thus, Castle undertook his first major writing project, the monumental Schools and Masters of Fence, 1884. There's my copy. Written and published in something of a youthful fervor, it was a comprehensive history tracing the development of European swordsmanship from the Middle Ages to the late Victorian era. Some of Castle's assertions in Schools and Masters have been widely criticized with the modern historical fencing movement. He appears to have accepted Pollock's assumption of a linear evolution in the design of swords and to have elaborated that assumption into his critique of earlier systems and theories of swordplay. Especially self-damning from the perspective of current scholarships are Castle's rather dismissive comments on the, quote, rough, untutored fighting of the Middle Ages and similar remarks. It is worth bearing in mind that Egerton Castle was only 26 when Schools and Masters was first published, and that he was a product of his times insofar as Victorian historians saw history as an evolutionary process, where while we understand evolution as a constant state of change and adaptation, the Victorians saw it as a constant state of improvement. And therefore, all things in the past were evolving toward the perfection of the modern day, which by this thinking, all historic weapons forms were somehow subsidiary to the perfection of the Victorian infantry saber on the battlefield and the foil in the saddle. Fencing was, to Castle, both a beautiful art and an exacting science. It seems that he was unable to reconcile his fencing with what he knew of the medieval styles. Of course, there was scant evidence on the medieval styles available at the time, especially when it came to the use of two-handed sword in armored combat, and most especially the combination of cut and thrust fencing with grappling techniques. As we shall see, it is evident that Castle later came to recognize the practical utility of such skills as wrestling at the sword. But in 1884, he clearly saw that the perfection of academic fencing in his own era as owing its origins to the rapier play of Camillo Agrippa. Acknowledging these limitations in light of the more recent scholarship, we must now consider the impact of Castle's work on the practical reconstruction of ancient swordplay in late Victorian England. Given its highly specialized subject matter and the fact that in 1884 Castle himself had no particular reputation as either an historian, a swordsman, nor as an author, Schools and Masters of Fence was actually extraordinarily successful. Critics called it a treasure, both admirable in execution and highly readable. Unauthorized translations quickly appeared in France, Germany, Italy, and Holland, some of which did not even offer credit in the form of Castle's name on the title page. Distribution and translation issues aside, the book was popular and impressive enough that on its strength, 2 years later, Castle found himself elected to the French Académie des Arts. The Académie was a then recently refounded institution whose original model dated back to the 16th century. Castle's election was a high honor indeed for an English scholar fencer who was still in his 20s. Only a few years after the publication of Schools and Masters, the historical record reveals that the practice of revived ancient swordplay in England. But before we investigate these reports, it's necessary to introduce our other main player, which is Captain Alfred Hutton. Hutton was nearly 20 years senior to Egerton Castle, born in English town of Beverley in 1839, the 11th and youngest child of a large family. He started fencing at the age of 12 in the London École d'Art of Henry Angelo, the younger. His father had studied there with Henry's father. Hutton matriculated at University College, Oxford in 1857, but left without graduating to join the 75th Cameron Highlanders in 1859. That was a tough time to be joining them. On arrival at the Perth Depot, he proved himself to be an excellent fencer, and when he transferred to his regiment's base, he was asked by his commanding officer, Colonel Hodgson, to organize a regimental fencing club. In 1862, Hutton produced his first book on fencing, simply entitled Swordsmanship, as a manual for the Cameron Fencing Club. 2 years later, Hutton transferred to the 7th Hussar and thence into the 1st King Dragoons Guards. He popularized the practice of fencing in every regiment to which he became attached. Invalided home to England in 1865, Hutton retained his particular enthusiasm for fencing. becoming the pupil and friend of William McTurk, who had taken over teaching at the Salle d'Angelo in St. James Street. The following year, Hutton also became a member of the London Fencing Club. Hutton received the rank of captain on September 30th, 1868, and retired from service in 1873. Thereafter, devoting himself largely to the study of fencing with the foil, the saber, that is an infantry saber, not the sport that doesn't exist yet, and the use of bayonet, as well as the use of quarterstaff. That's Egerton Castle. Although we have no record of their first meeting, it seems likely that Hutton and Castle met shortly after Henry Irving's production of Hamlet. Note that Castle, having been impressed by the performance, sought out Hutton, who had choreographed the fights for that particular production. In the introduction to Schools and Masters, Castle mentions that, quote, some time ago, Hutton had lent him a magnificent collection of books treating of the sword and its use ranging in date from the early 16th century to the present day. Would that we all had friends that would lend us 17th century books. Castle's dedication may also be revealing. It's inscribed to Baron de Casson and Captain A. Hutton in recollection of, and I quote, many pleasant hours spent with the former among old books and old arms, and with the latter in the fencing room, foil in hand. Castle's reference to Baron de Casson opens up another interesting sphere of investigation. Captain Charles Baron de Casson was contemporaneous with Hutton, and although not a swordsman himself in the practical sense, he was an inveterate collector of antique arms and armor. In 1881, de Casson had founded and become president of a private gentlemen's club, whose membership were restricted to only 20 men, including a number of famous artists and well-connected antiquarians. All were strictly amateur enthusiasts devoted to the location, study, and preservation of ancient swords and suits of armor. Thus, this select assembly was known as the Kernoozers Club. The name Kernoozer can be a little confusing. It apparently had to do with these, how can I explain this? A couple of guys who were interested collectors of antique arms and armor had gone to an auction, I think it was Sotheby's, and were at the preview looking at pieces that were going to be for sale. They asked one of the docents who was working there, who was actually just a guy who was hired to move things, very working class from the East End of London, and they asked him a question about a particular gauntlet or helmet or suit of armor or something, to which the working class East End London replied, can't ask me, sir, I ain't no Kernoozer. He was trying to say connoisseur, but he didn't understand the term. To which the collector said, well then, if you're not a Kernoozer, we must be. We are now the Kernoozers. The word Kernoozer thereafter became something of a lighthearted code word among club members, used to describe various attitudes and actions relating to the study of ancient arms and armor, as in the phrase, I kernoozled a fine helmet the other day. By the 1890s, the definition of kernoozing had been extended to the practice of searching out antique treatises and manuscripts for the purpose of adapting them to contemporary swordsmanship and fencing. Gentlemen, this may seem familiar. Apparently what we're doing is kernoozing. Although the Kernoozers were not precisely a secret society, their meetings were not typically open to reporters nor to the general public, and very few detailed accounts of their activities have survived. However, the atmosphere of a typical late-night Kernoozers Club meeting was described in a 1908 biography of the artist Jean Petit.
Nice.
That is actually Hutton and Castle with the weapons in hand, being surrounded by Kernoozers. Quote, though never a member, Petit was a frequent visitor at the Kernoozers Club, a select little body of artists and others who were united by a common love of arms and armor. It was founded in the studio of Mr. Monsieur Seymour Lucas in 1880 and is still in existence. Baron de Casson, the famous collector, was the first president, Mr. Lucas being vice president, while at a later period Mr. Egerton Castle became champion swordsman to the club. Good fellowship and sound scholarship were the two main essentials. Entertainment for the evening was provided by the member of the by the member at whose house the monthly meeting was held. It was a strict regulation that the fare should be of the simplest kind: roast beef, cheese, beer, claret, pipes, tobacco, whiskey, and nothing more. Amid the wreaths of smoke, they held debate on historical dress and fine armor, on casque and chamfron, soleray and cuisse. Various Kernoozers brought the pieces of armor which they had acquired during the month. These were discussed, and sometimes a paper was read. On a special visitor's night, Mr. Egerton Castle and another member would explain feats of swordsmanship or illustrate a sword and dagger fight. In fact, I did read another account that I don't have the text of here, but they were known to test armor by putting it on and then seeing if they could bounce down the stairs. To which every museum curator says, no. It is believed that Captain Sir Richard Francis Burton, oops, these are somewhat out of order, Egerton Castle and Walter Pollock were all members of the Kernoozers Club, both Pollock and especially Burton being eminently well qualified to have partnered Castle in demonstrations of practical swordsmanship. So this is the situation, the cast of characters at the dawn of the 1880s. But before we assess what transpired, let us briefly examine the precedent for displays of historical swordsmanship. Early revivals. Prior to the exhibitions of historical fencing during the late 1880s, there were some precedents, including the long European tradition of historical military pageantry, such as elaborate reenactments of medieval tournaments, which dated back to the early part of the century. As early as the 1820s, exhibitions of mock gladiatorial combat had been staged in French pleasure gardens for the amusement of family audiences. Similarly, while those knights who competed in the famous Eglinton tourney of 1839, anybody know the Eglinton tourney? Rob knows, great. Yeah, read up on the Eglinton tourney, fantastic story. Yeah, medieval tournament, full armor, everything as you imagine, but in 1839. That took considerable pains to look the part, but their jousting and swordplay appears to have been essentially, shall we say, improvised. The earliest systematic revival of historical fencing style may have been that associated with a group of Spanish fencers led by the art critic Gregorio Cruzada Villamil. This revival effort began in Madrid during the late 1850s and is reported to have continued until Villamil's death in 1884. It was based upon the voluminous and fantastically elaborate printed works of Francisco Dorada. Oh, there's Burton. What's he doing there? There's Burton in his fencing uniform, actually. Here's Dorada. Dorada's work presented the traditional aristocratic system of Spanish rapier fencing known as la verdadera destreza, or the true skill. According to one critic writing in 1887, we are pleased to be able to report that the Spanish school, la verdadera destreza, is being reborn, an effort led by the Italians now spreading throughout all of Europe. Jacob, the first teacher of Paris, follows our old rules. Marignac has established a school of sword and dagger fencing, and Lamarche has written down the theories and rules of Perez de Mendoza. To Spain they have come, in the days in which we write these lines, Italian and French, to perfect themselves in the art of the sword. So there was some effort taking place. Thus Villamil and his associates appear to have been part of a project to reinvigorate an elderly but still living tradition of Spanish swordsmanship by an infusion of theories and practices drawn from that same tradition, as recorded by Dorada some 150 years earlier. Contemporary newspapers record a series of exhibitions presenting their reconstructions of antique rapier and dagger play for appreciative audiences in Madrid. The earliest deliberate revival of an archaic fencing style in London appears to have been not of swordplay, but rather of quarterstaff fencing. Comparatively little is known of the origins of this revival, including, importantly for present purposes, whether it was based on any direct application of historical research. Newspaper reports suggest that an exhibition of French batons at a military display in Belfast during the year 1851 may have inspired the idea of reviving quarterstaff fencing as a competitive sport. The truth is, a number of things had to come together. First of all, the Victorian obsession with all things medieval, Sir Walter Scott, the pre-Raphaelites, you get the idea, you've seen it in their art and literature. but also the Victorian invention of sport and mass production of sports equipment. You can't do quarterstaff fencing without saber masks, boxing gloves, and cricket pads. And since those were now available, they could do that. Also, it was the first time that Europe saw bamboo and rattan being imported from the Far East and the Asia Pacific. So it gave them something that wasn't an oak stick and a bare head to work with. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because I realize that this is a 50-page lecture. Lots of notes. So here's Burton, not with a quarterstaff, with an assegai spear, but there's Burton.
Yay!
And there's first position guard in a quarterstaff treatise by R.G. Allinson Wynne, memory serves. And that brings us to here. German-born Dorette Wilke emigrated to England as a young teenager in 1885. Wilke later reported that she studied both classical French foil with French masters and also the fencing of the 16th century, being tutored by none other than Captain Alfred Hutton. Wilke went on to become a famous and influential teacher of physical culture in her own right. If her assertion was correct, then she may have been among the first students of Hutton's ancient swordplay. In the introduction to Sword in the Centuries, Hutton reminisced about young soldiers and schoolboys learning historical fencing at the School of Arms and London Rifle Brigade. Prominent among them was Cyril Matthey, a member of the LRB, who had started fencing in 1876 at the age of 12. There he is, Cyril Matthey. By 1885, Matthey was the chief instructor at the London Rifle Brigade School of Arms. His fellow students of historical fencing during this period included 11-year-old Ernest Stetson Cook, Herbert Wittau, and a whole bunch of other people whose names you won't recognize. There is reason to believe that Egerton Castle was an occasional visitor to the LRB classes as well. It seems that these classes were not part of the official physical cultural program offered to the soldiers, but were something more of in the nature of a sort of extracurricular activity, a boys' club centered on the revival of ancient swordsmanship. As they gained in years and experience, the eager young students would then go out and perform their own demonstrations of ancient fencing at local secondary schools. An image like this is very, very telling. I mean, obviously what he's holding is a cup-hilt rapier of the 17th century, but he's dressed in clothing of the late 19th century. This is a very anachronistic sort of image, but not nearly as anachronistic as what followed. I love this guy. This period saw several presentations, possibly inspired by Castle's Schools and Masters of Fence, that sought to infuse the traditional assault at arms with various historically inspired forms of swordplay. In early 1888, Austrian Fechtmeister Johann Hartl, here he is, organized an unusual traveling fencing display. Hartl had specialized in training young Viennese society women in various fencing skills, and somehow persuaded their parents to allow him to escort their daughters on a vaudeville tour throughout Europe and then the US, exhibiting their skills with rapiers, which were actually foils, and daggers, as well as cavalry sabers and two-handed swords. My hero. For some time, the troupe was based at the Eden Musée, a vaudeville house in New York City, and they toured widely throughout the country, including engagements in Boston and Chicago. The Hartl troupe's performances actually sparked a brief craze for foil and dagger fencing among well-to-do American society women. How odd is that? In many cases, the only surviving records are newspaper reports that do not offer enough detail for us to be able to judge the degree of historical accuracy that may have been attempted by the performers, although there seems to be no doubt that the exhibitions by the LRB School of Arms Club and those by Castle, etc. at the Kernoozers Club would have been high on the degree of accuracy scale for their time. It was also in 1889 that Egerton Castle first tried his hand at theatrical fight choreography. Assisted by Walter Pollock, he staged the fight sequences for Richard Mansfield's production of Richard III at Globe Theatre, with, we may be assured, more than the usual level of concern for historical accuracy. Castle had also been hard at work on his first novel, Consequences, which was published in early 1891. Perhaps inspired by the trend toward practical exhibitions of historical fencing, he then initiated what may have been his first formal public collaboration with Captain Hutton on the story of swordsmanship, described here in a contemporary newspaper. Some 14 years ago, Mr. Egerton Castle was so impressed with the admirable fencing of Mr. Irving as Hamlet that the Spectator determined to acquire the art himself. Can we keep it quiet in the back, please? Thank you. Not only has Mr. Castle become one of the most skillful exponents, but he has devoted much time and research to its history. As a result, and the result was given us this Wednesday afternoon, February the 25th, on the stage at the Lyceum Theatre, kindly lent to us by Sir Henry Irving. We heard a most interesting paper read by Mr. Castle entitled The Story of Swordsmanship, specially considered in connection with the rise and decline of dueling. Would that there were space available to enlarge on the merits of this discourse, for considering its limits, it was most comprehensive and quoted the best authorities on the subject, namely themselves. The various weapons in the shape of swords, daggers, rapiers, and foils, and their special uses were illustrated in the most finished and masterly manner by Egerton Castle, Captain Hutton, Dr. Mount Briggs, Sir Frederick and Mr. Walter Pollock, Professor Bailey, and Maître d'Armes Philippe Bourgeois. All good men and true, the two latter especially well versed in l'escrime. These are images from that lecture. A reviewer from the Stage offered a glowing report on the Lyceum Theatre presentation, also offering the detail that Mr. Castle's wrist is stronger than his voice, and we are famed to confess that some portions of his delivery were somewhat inaudible to us. The audience of 300 guests were seated on bleachers on the giant stage of the Lyceum with their backs to the orchestra pit, an arrangement that conjured an ambiance closer to that of a lecture hall than a traditional theatrical presentation. It is noteworthy that reviews of the Lyceum Theatre exhibition appear to confirm that Sir Frederick Pollock, as well as his younger brother Walter, were actively involved in ancient swordplay during this period. Of course, Sir Frederick's essay and lecture on fencing history had been among the Castle's early motivations to write his book. Other than completing the circle that had begun in 1883, when young Egerton had been inspired by Sir Henry Irving's fencing, the Lyceum Theatre exhibition was highly significant in that it was the first time that experiments of Hutton and Castle had been presented for public approval. We all need to make our rope barriers out of blades. In this case, you have Hutton at the podium speaking, while I think that is Castle. Far left is Castle, and then facing is Frederick Pollock. It's important to underscore that many of these men were wealthy, distinguished, and influential in extremely class-conscious London of the 1890s. Such a demonstration, hosted by the famous Henry Irving and attended by numerous political, sporting, and military nobles, would perhaps be roughly equivalent to a martial arts exhibition today, hosted by Sir Ian McClellan, and featuring performances by Jackie Chan, Randy Couture, and Supreme Court Justice Roberts. Little wonder then that the event became the talk of London, especially when Edward VII, the Prince of Wales, wrote to Mr. Irving and asked if the display might be repeated so that he and his friends could see it. Of course, the display was duly repeated for the Prince and his entourage, the return engagement taking place on March 20th of 1891. Hutton, just as much as his friend Castle, was devoted to the art of sword in all of its forms, and in one area in particular, his interest evidently exceeded Castle's. As well as reviving historical systems out of an antiquarian interest, Hutton had continued to publish books on military close combat with weapons, including Swordsmanship for the Use of Soldiers, 1887, Cold Steel, and Fixed Bayonets, a complete system of defense for the British magazine rifle, both in 1890. Captain Hutton held a deep and long-standing concern about the standard of training in close combat skills being offered to British soldiers, particularly in the wake of numerous reports that they were coming off second best in hand-to-hand skirmishes against tribesmen such as Zulu, Afridi, and Maori warriors, amongst many others. He basically is bemoaning the fact that with a sword, the English sucked, because they couldn't get anybody to practice sword fighting because it was it had become the sport of fencing, which seemed a bit French. And nobody wanted to do it. It was too kind of wussy. They continued to do good old-fashioned single-stick competitions, but single-stick does not prepare you for facing the Zulu. Part of the aim of the Royal Tournament and Assault at Arms, in which Egerton Castle had competed so successfully a few years previously, was to encourage soldiers and officers to develop greater skill in exactly these areas. However, Hutton recognized the drawbacks as well as the advantages created by the artificial conventions of any sort of a sporting competition. The system of military saber proposed in Cold Steel, for example, was largely based on a combination of the systems of Domenico Angelo, the then contemporary Italian school of saber fence as advocated by Masiello and Quillini, and the works of various 18th century backsword masters, including Hope and McBain. It also referenced several much earlier works, including George Silver's work in the 1590s. Hutton was attempting to devise a system of fighting as distinct from other dueling or academic play with the English cavalry and then also the infantry saber. In the same year, here's Hutton. Look at him. Again, swept hilt rapier in his hand, cup hilt rapier on the table, but notice the print behind him, which is actually a plate from, what is that? That's a plate from Rodolfo Capoferro, actually. In the same year, Hutton published his first practical treatment specifically devoted to ancient styles of fence. It was called Old Swordplay. Again, this is my copy. You can't have it. It was an illustrated survey of fencing systems from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, including 58 illustrations from, if any of these names mean anything to you, Alfieri, Angelo, De Grazia, Leoncourt, Achille Marozzo, and other famous masters. Used as an instruction manual, this book might be used to recreate some of the plays of two-handed sword, rapier and dagger, rapier and cloak, cloak and dagger, broadsword and buckler, case of rapier, and the French smallsword. Old swordplay was well received by the critics. Captain Hutton's clear and concise treatment of this curious form of swordplay, illustrated as it is by plates from Marozzo and De Grazia, is extremely interesting. This latest contribution to the literature of fencing should not be neglected by anyone interested in that fine art. That's from the London Illustrated News. In his preface, Hutton noted that there are those who affect to ridicule the study of obsolete weapons, alleging that it is of no practical use. Everything, however, is useful to the art of fence. And by the way, you should understand fence in its historical term. It is not the sport fencing. It is fencing, fence, defense are all the same word. It is the art of defense. It is useful to the art of fence, which tends to create an interest in it. And certain it is that such contests as rapier and dagger, two-hand sword, or broadsword and hand buckler are very, very great embellishments to the somewhat monotonous proceedings of the ordinary assault of arms. As we have seen, stage combat was yet another of Hutton's interests in the application of this art, and one that was very much shared by Castle as well. It is also significant that Hutton noted the utility of presentations of ancient swordplay as a means of attracting attention to the modern sport of competitive fencing. How am I doing on time? Anyone?
20 minutes.
20 minutes? I thought
It's 4:40.
5 minutes and
Another hour?
I have 5 minutes.
Oh, 5 minutes.
So let's look at some slides. I'll tell you what. Skip that. Yeah, that's another exhibition. That's an exhibition of two-handed longsword. Note they're using a Federschwert that is based on those depicted in Joachim Meyer's treatise from 16th century Germany. Here's a good example of an assault at arms where you see a wide variety of things from going kind of clockwise. You see an infantry saber, or perhaps single stick, I can't quite read it. Then you have saber against bayonet. Then you've got some unarmed material taking place, and a bit of French foil down at the bottom left. Here's a French display of history of swordsmanship, in this case sword and shield versus longsword. I think it's interesting that the weapons they're holding have nothing to do with the costumes they're wearing.
The French are fashionable.
Is that what they call it? There's Castle toward the end of his life. Note the small sword, Italian foil, and in his hand, the rapier. He and his wife Agnes, they successfully published many romances and adventure novels. If you want a jolly good Victorian page turner, Google the work of Egerton Castle, and you'll other than his historical material, they were all these kind of historical romances in the style of Sir Walter Scott, etc. I love images like this. They're using these Zweihänder Spadone in Victorian fencing kit, but wearing steel plate gauntlets from the 15th century, lent to them by the Kernoozers.
Like you do.
This is Esme Beringer. She was a famous actress who was noted for her ability. She was a private student of Captain Hutton's. He trained her personally. She became worldwide famous for her Shakespeare and her ability to actually fight. And there's one of her postcards. Okay, as we go through, like we're out of time, this all leads to the Bartitsu Club, by the way, to kind of bring circle. After this started to become well established, Hutton and Castle needed a place to teach these classes. They ended up doing an exhibition on stage alongside a chap named Edward William Barton Wright, pictured in the middle, who was demonstrating his new self-defense system known as Bartitsu. He had just opened the Bartitsu School of Arms at Shaftesbury Ave in the East End of London and offered the training facilities for Hutton and Castle's ancient swordplay classes. So on one side of the room you've got pugilists, saboteur, Lacan and Kane experts, grappling and wrestling experts, all developing a new self-defense form, while on the other side of the room there's rapier and dagger, backsword, and quarterstaff, all taking part. It is our conjecture that those two sides of the room did not ignore each other, but were helped cross-pollinate and figure out the principles at play. I ended up studying Bartitsu not because of any Sherlock Holmes connection, but because I went looking for, when I read in Egerton Castle, in Alfred Hutton, that the home of historical swordplay in Britain was the Bartitsu Club. I said, what the hell's a Bartitsu Club? Because I wanted to know who his students were. So I went in search of the Bartitsu Club, and as a result I found out, oh, there's this thing called Bartitsu. And came to it through that door. Next workshop is of Bartitsu, so we get to go do some of this stuff. There's the story of swordsmanship presented by Captain Hutton and Castle. And there's Pierre Vigny, and there's Hutton right before the end of his life, that was about a year before he died. Drawing to a close. Basically, Hutton and Castle, they train this body of students as swordsmen. Those swordsmen all go off and do great things and have this very kind of historic sense of honor, which leads them all to go die in the trenches of the First World War, because that was what that was the right thing to go do. After the First World War, there is almost no mention of historic swordsmanship going forward. There's the survival of the sport of fencing, and that goes through another 5-hour lecture on what happens between the year 1900 and the year 2000 that now shows you that bollocks that you see in the Olympics, which is a great sport, but it's not swordsmanship. That's a fascinating thing that we'll talk about later. This is a German Schlock. Last of the Old Swordsman. There he is. There's Saint Hutton himself in his very last portrait. There's Castle just before he died. And basically, so where does this information get preserved? Lost in archives for a start, but it gets preserved on the stage, because that's where they need it. That's where they need to know Renaissance rapier, for example. Then comes this guy, Douglas Fairbanks Sr., who in the film The Black Pirate invents a new genre. He was the author. He wrote, directed, and starred in The Black Pirate in 1930. And in doing so created